Someday. I would love an explanation as to why that particular wind chime is in the yard. Why is there a wind chime of bones? Who put that there? Who put that there? Why'd they put that there? Who made it?
Will we ever get it?
I don't think we'll ever get that explanation.
Right away, coming in hot with the
You
twins.
are going to die in there. We got bats. Hey, trees.
Those kids look like they came directly from the 1970s, though.
Right?
Like,
Do you think that was their actual hair?
I also love that the child's name is Troy, which is also such a 1970s callback.
It really is. It's also just like the perfectly fitting douchebag kid name.
My uncle's name is Troy. I was gonna comment on this song because, well, it's a TikTok viral song now.
Yeah, but I think that would have probably have stemmed from this.
Absolutely.
I don't think anybody was listening to it before then.
Oh no, this is a freshly dead animal. I don't think I've ever realized that before. It's breathing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. If I saw a freshly dead animal in a house that I am not supposed to be in, you think I'm just gonna hang around?
I mean, I would have turned back like like 4 shattered glass fixtures ago because this entire place screams, I'm gonna die here.
And instead these kids are like, a door just opened, let's go in.
Horror is predicated on people making terrible decisions.
I don't want to come like hot out the gate with some really unpopular opinions, but
Yeah.
like, I'm sorry, you deserve bad things if this is the choices that you make.
Listen, she told you you were gonna regret it. And for about 3 seconds, you did. You called the police. This is when you wait outside.
Oh yeah.
Why call them if you're gonna choose violence yourself?
I'm sorry, officer. I stabbed him to death before. Okay, now we're in the opening credits.
Classic. Oh my god, I remember these opening credits scared the living daylights out of me the first time I watched it because I watched the show on a whim. At like midnight I started.
Can't remember what possessed me to watch this, but I watched it by myself in my dorm room. I mean, you and I never watched Murder House together. We came together whenever we became friends.
We're in a coven.
Yeah. They always have to fuck them, don't they? Does this realtor also need therapy?
Bloodshed and awkward masturbation.
The horror concept of twins, specifically The Shining, but other lesser known.
I feel like there's a common intersection between haunted house stories and disintegration of relationships.
It's a filthy goddamn horror show.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, friends.
Hello, friends and neighbors. If you're listening, thank you for being here. I'm not sure how you got here, but
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being here. This is my dear best friend, Nathan Skethway.
and this is my lifelong paramour, Monique Quistorf.
And you are listening to It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show. Nathan and I met in 2013. We attended the same undergraduate college, and we almost immediately bonded over horror. I think one of the first films that we watched together was the new Carrie that had come out. And then, of course, subsequently, had to watch American Horror Story together as it aired.
I was obsessed with American Horror Story at that point because I had been watching the first 2 seasons before I transferred to the same college, so it was amazing for me to find a friend who was as into it as I was and like that I could share it with.
And I was so glad I didn't have to watch it alone anymore. But we've consumed a lot of horror together over the years, binged a lot of horror franchises, kind of delved into, the full spectrum of horror together, and have always had really good, interesting conversations about horror together. But this is not just a horror podcast.
So basically what Monique and I are planning to do is that we are going to rewatch the entirety of American Horror Story, starting with season 1, Murder House. And with every episode that we watch, each of us is going to pick 2 things to bring to the episode. We're going to watch a movie that is in some way inspired by something that we saw in the episode, something that we heard, something that it made us think about. And then we're also going to bring a topic. This could be something, a real life story that was used in the episode as an influence, or something that our research from watching the episode led us to, but in some way it will be related to American Horror Story and related to the American horror genre as a whole.
I will mention I'm a therapist, so another perspective that I'm able to bring to the podcast is a mental health perspective, which, you know, American Horror is chock full of opportunities to talk about mental health at its best and its worst.
I'm a writer and I really love film, so I'll probably be bringing you a lot of production facts and general cinema knowledge and trivia.
We also do this cute thing at the very end where we give you a little extra nugget of information. It's not very long, but it's still very interesting. Our goal is for our listeners to always learn something new, unless you are just as nerdy and weird as we are.
In which case, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Please stay. Please stay. Thank you. But our hope is to teach someone something new every time we sit down to have this experience together.
The whole thing is going to be an adventure. You're along for the ride with us. Just settle in and pray for us.
It can only go up from here.
I like that optimism.
With that being said, Nathan, I would like to talk about The Shining.
Oh, you watched The Shining this week. Tell me about The Shining, Monique.
So, especially after we went through this whole spiel about how we are horror buffs, we are fascinated by horror. I am ashamed to say this is the first time I've seen The Shining. I have some things to say. I know that the book is very different than the movie. I know that Stephen King does not like the portrayal of his book. And I mean, even in my research, I found that there were some things that were fundamentally different that are now, like, iconic.
That's true.
I feel challenged by, Jack's character, Jack, the character, being basically an antagonist from the very beginning. I mean, until the very end, of course, and I don't know if I want to give away spoilers to anyone who hasn't seen The Shining.
I think this is a good time to mention that this show is going to be spoiler ridden across the board. If we mention something, be it an episode of American Horror Story or a movie or whatever, and you haven't seen it and you don't want the ending to be spoiled, I don't want to tell you that you should tune out, but you should probably tune out because we're absolutely going to spoil it. I don't think there's a way we can have full conversations the way that we need to without spoiling some endings. And I think hopefully the people that are listening to this are fellow horror nerds, and most of them will have seen most of the things that we're talking about.
The Shining came out in 1980. That is 40 years ago. So if you have not seen The Shining, like me, up until a week ago, I'm sorry, but maybe you deserve to have it spoiled for you. So the ending, I can't make sense of it. He's been there the whole time.
I have heard that particular read of that final shot of him in the photo before. That is certainly not what's going on in the book. I think what Stanley Kubrick was going for in showing that, and I'm sure film buffs everywhere will probably hate me for not knowing this, but I think what Kubrick is going for at the ending is that Jack has been sort of absorbed into the hotel. It's not the Overlook is haunted by ghosts, but there's also just sort of like, very similar to Murder House, there's also just a darkness there that draws people in and pulls people in. It wants people. It's hungry as a place, which is horrifying. So I think what they're going for there is that Jack has been sort of absorbed into it, and any trace of the old Jack is gone.
With Jack Nicholson's eyebrows, he can only be a bad guy.
I have to agree with you. There was not a point in that movie where I was more afraid of Jack Nicholson than I had been from the beginning, because he just carries such a menace about him at all times that from the first shot I was like, this dude is it's going to be him. He's going to be the one.
Well, and it's a recipe for disaster from the beginning. He's like, yeah, I broke my son's arm like 5 months ago and I'm only 5 months sober. But yeah, send me to this place where someone murdered his family and himself. Sign me up. This sounds like paradise. He's literally like, this is the best thing I could ever ask for. The other thing that just infuriated me to no end, which infuriates me in all horror films where this occurs, is like this fumbling, this perpetual fumbling of like, we can't get to the snowcat fast enough. Let's trip over our legs 3 times while we get there. And I'm like, ugh.
That stresses me out to no end. Older horror movies, especially from that time period, 70s and 80s or so, are very guilty of that a lot of the tension comes from the characters just being wildly inept.
Well, the reason I chose The Shining is because the topic I'm bringing is twins, the use of twins in horror.
Creepy twins.
If you haven't seen the first episode of Murder House of American Horror Story, it starts with a set of twins, these 2 little redheaded boys.
Sure does.
Who are causing trouble. And you know, these twins in the episode are not particularly creepy. They definitely come in handy later, right? Even later in the episode, they show up, I think it's behind Vivian, cut up.
Yeah, I hate that moment.
Well, I'm just gonna kind of give you a little bit of information about general information, because obviously there's going to be future episodes where it's going to be very easy for me to go into much more specific twin influences. You know, I think about, you know, Freak Show, specifically the use of twins and the real people that those twins were inspired by. But generally, twins are creepy. And the fun fact is, you know, Nathan, you probably already know this, but the fun fact is that in the book, they're not supposed to be twins. Those 2 girls in the hallway, they're not supposed to be twins.
You're right. I had actually forgotten that. They aren't twins. They're just sisters. I wonder what the impetus for changing that was.
Well, it was because when the real life twins who auditioned, the director was like, no, this is creepy. We got to keep this.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. It's so important and iconic to the identity of the movie now.
There was one film critic, I don't know his name, who postulated that the way that the twins are posed in the movie could represent that they are the same person, that they're just one person.
Ooh.
The one thing that I did pick up on while I was watching the movie, though, is, you know, they talk about the previous family that was murdered. You know, a father murdered his wife and his 2 daughters who were 8 and 10 years old. If those are supposed to be the daughters, they're not supposed to be twins either. They've just dressed them up to be twins.
Oh, wow.
Plot holes everywhere, okay? So, twins are creepy for several reasons. Obviously, and you know what? All the reasons feel obvious. But maybe not until someone tells you. Their extreme similarity and being virtually indistinguishable. They embody the repetition, and the repetition of the same thing is one of the elements that Sigmund Freud identified as being connected to the uncanny. And the uncanny involves the experience of something familiar being rendered unfamiliar, or the opposite, something new feeling familiar to you. So that creates like a discomfort, right, to have that repetition, but there's the opposite of where you feel comforted by seeing the same thing over again. Like something that's unfamiliar feels safe or familiar to you. And that's because unfamiliar things should not feel safe. So there's like 2 ends of the spectrum of the uncanny. It's, you know, being unsettled by things that are ordinary and feeling comforted by things that should be unsettling. And then, you know, there's also in many, many movies, there's the trope of the good twin versus the evil twin. This is not the case in The Shining. This is also not the case in this season of American Horror Story. Both those boys were not angels. So I don't know what kind of life they lived before they died in that house, but
I mean, we our introduction was throwing rocks and making fun of a little girl, so it can't be great.
Smashing fetuses in jars. I mean, just generally being in places where they shouldn't be. But this represents, the moral struggle between good and bad, right and wrong. There's also like this division of like a socialized version of yourself, a socially acceptable version versus, what you're repressing or what you wish you could actually do, like the good twin versus the evil twin. Because sometimes in movies where this trope is used, there's not even twins. There's not even like the use of twins. It's just like this notable transition between the good character and the bad character who happen to be the same character. And of course, for some of these movies, like there is that kind of speculation of maybe they are twins, but maybe it's the same person. And evil twins are the extensions of the trope of the double or the shadow self. Being able to kind of pit those poor choices, those malevolent choices on an evil entity that is not you. Or like there's of course some movies where there's a bad twin who poses as the good twin for evil, obviously evil and nefarious reasons. But they're able to do that because there is a good twin that they can pretend to be. And then eventually, the good and the evil collapsing into one being. It's usually how most of those movies end. I know at least some like literature references would be William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe, The Student of Prague, The Black Room, Twins of Evil. Some movies that are just of note: Sisters, directed by Bryan De Palma in 1972.
He directed the original Carrie.
I love the original Carrie. But the use of twins can be traced all the way back to Shakespeare. But there's The Lost Valley, written by Algernon Blackwood in 1910, and Dead Ringers by David Cronenberg in 1988. So as I said, this is more of like a general use of twins, because I have many opportunities in the future, or Nathan does, to get into the specific use of twins to motivate plot, to inform plot, or like the real life inspirations of people. But I found a very interesting story of real life twins.
Ooh. Tell me an interesting story about real life twins, Monique.
I also just want to say I love a horror story based on a true story. I love horror in real life. I mean, mostly I don't like real life murders. Let me just disclaimer that I do not condone murders. Please, no murdering.
Absolutely not. We don't condone murder here at
it's a filthy
goddamn horror show.
But the things that are just unexplainable, I mean, I'll be honest, like murder and gore, it's pretty far down on my preferred horror. I want you to play some mind games with me. I want you to make me confused, to make me ask questions. And I kind of want you to make me feel afraid of the possibility, not like the real life possibility of being murdered, because unfortunately, but just like the distinct possibility of something just creepy happening and having no explanation why, and just having to live with being unsettled. So I found an unsettling story about twins.
I'm so excited.
June and Jennifer Gibsons, born April 11th, 1963, in Yemen. They were originally from America. Their parents moved to Yemen and moved back. These girls they're not the only children. They had several other siblings as well. But these girls had a very interesting relationship. And I'm sure you've heard, stereotypes about twins, but this kind of takes it a step further. They had a secret language, which is not uncommon for twins. But their secret language qualified as an example of cryptophagia, which is a phenomenon of language developed by twins that only the two children can understand, and includes mirrored actions. So, twin walk and identical mannerisms are some examples that they gave. And this is often associated with idioglossia, which is any language used by only one or very few people.
Wow.
So, and so far not so creepy, right? I mean, like, twins have, I mean, I'll be honest, I feel like a lot of my information comes from TV, so I guess if there are any real life twins out there who want to confirm or deny, please be my guest. But twins have their secret language. You know, they grow up side by side. They grow in the womb together. Like, it's just that connection that you have with someone. But there came a point where these girls would only talk to each other. They would not talk to anybody else. It should also, maybe, like, to compound kind of the situation that these girls are in, it should be mentioned that the children, the whole family, were the only black family in a largely white community, and these girls were ostracized at school. I mean, you can imagine it'd be like, what, the 1970s, when they were attending elementary and primary school, so it's a tough, I mean, it's still a tough time to be black, but it wasn't any better back then either. So they were dismissed from school early. Like, they fully stopped school at a certain point because of the difficult experiences that they had while they were going to school, which, you know, limited their social pool, just kind of hyper bonded them together because they didn't have any other social outlets. Oh, I did include an interesting fact in here, generally just about twins. As I'm, 50% of young twins will have their own twin language that they use to communicate with each other and cannot be understood by others. So I wasn't being too general when I said that this does happen.
That's crazy. I didn't know that. I knew that was a trope, but I didn't realize that was like a real life thing. That's insane.
Well, and a main cause for this is a delay in phonological development of one or both twins, because they develop the ability to communicate with one another without working within the grammar of their parents' language. You know, when it's a single child and a grown-up is able to model and correct, but when there are two twins, especially when one is more delayed than the other one is going to try to find a way to communicate. That's their person. So like I said, June and Jennifer eventually spoke to nobody but each other and their younger sister, Rose. While they were still attending school, they refused to read or write. You know, their parents took notice. Their parents did the best that they could with the resources that they had, and were troubled by the fact that they wouldn't talk to anyone else and wouldn't read or write. And they sent them to separate boarding schools to hopefully foster some separation, some social building. This did not go well, and this is, I think, when it starts to get really, really spooky, because when they were separated, and they saw several therapists in this process, but when they were separated, they became catatonic and entirely withdrawn. So they just retreated into themselves, just non-responsive. Like, it's basically comatose. I mean, your eyes are open, but you're just not responsive to stimuli around you. I mean, there are even some instances where people just appear to be frozen, to just stuck still. So they came back together. You know, this was definitely not progress. This was not movement in the right direction. But their bizarre behaviors continued. They had weird rituals where they would decide which of the twins would wake up first, who would breathe first, and who wasn't allowed to do anything until the other one did it first.
Oh my God.
They were also very creative. They were both writers, and if you can imagine, their stories were very horror specific. Let me just tell you about some of the things that they wrote. There was a story written about a high school hero being seduced by a teacher and then preyed upon by a gay guard at a penitentiary. This was called The Pepsi Cola Addict. There was another story about a physician eager to save his child's life by killing the family dog to obtain its heart.
These are being written at what age?
This would be like high schoolish age. So it's
Cool. Normal stuff.
There's another twist to this story about the dog heart, because the dog's spirit lives on in the child and seeks revenge on the father. This is called the Pugilist. And then there's a story about a young woman who discovers that the atmosphere of a local disco causes patrons to engage in acts of insane violence, and this is called discomania. I'm
quite intrigued.
So you can see like where their minds were, the kinds of things that inspired them. They also did this fun thing where they tried to kill each other occasionally. Jennifer tried to strangle June with a radio cord, and June threw Jennifer off a bridge as a retaliation. So June and Jennifer were admitted to Broadmoor Hospital in 1981 after committing several crimes. I think there was arson and burglary involved, and were sentenced to indefinite detention. And they remained at Broadmoor for 11 years. So if they were born in 1963 and were admitted in 1981, so these girls were 18 being admitted into an inpatient hospital, and it's the 1980s. Things had improved, but at least in the way that people are able to care for mental health at that time. But they stayed there for 11 years. A journalist for the Sunday Times, Marjorie Wallace, wrote a book about June and Jennifer in 1986. So she spent a lot of time with the girls, learning about them, and learning about their little quirks, their connection. It was revealed that June and Jennifer had a pact that if one of them died, the other must begin to speak and live a normal life. And during their stay at Broadmoor, they began to believe that this was actually necessary for one of them to die. Like, it wasn't like when one of us dies, it was like one of us has to die.
Oh my God.
And Jennifer agreed to be the one to die. So in March of 1993, June and Jennifer were transferred to a new hospital. It's supposed to be a less restrictive, more opportunities kind of hospital, a more free, independent living.
Sounds fake.
Well, Jennifer, upon arrival, could not be roused. She died when she got there of sudden inflammation of the heart, but there was no evidence of drugs or poison in her system, and her death actually continues to remain a mystery.
What?
So Jennifer fulfilled her promise to sacrifice herself.
She just up and died? Just by willpower
she just up and
alone?
Up and died.
My God.
There's some information where June did say that Jennifer was acting differently like the week before they were transferred, but nobody looked into it. I think she even tried to sue the Broadmoor Hospital after her release, but nothing came of that. But by 2008, June was living independently without being monitored by psychiatric services, and she's still living to this day. She's been accepted by her community. She lives near her family. I think we should maybe listen to this song together, but this story, the story of these two girls, inspired the 1998 Manic Street Preacher song, Tsunami. And a Polish filmmaker, I'm going to butcher this name, and I feel disrespectful that I don't know how to pronounce this name, Agnieszka Smocznika? is set to direct a feature film based on Marjorie Wallace's book about June and Jennifer. It's supposed to come out, I think, in 20. It's in development right now. So will be a feature film about the Silent Twins. That's what they're called. That's what they've been.
That's amazing. The Silent Twins. Wow. My mind is a little bit blown. I had never heard any of that before.
I didn't either.
Fucking wild.
I'm so intrigued by real life stories of just creepy, unexplainable occurrences of why did this have to happen this way, and it just got creepier. The more I read, I was like, how do I not talk about this crazy thing? It has nothing to do with American Horror Story, but twins can be creepy.
My mind is blown. On that note, I think it's probably a good time to take a breather and go to a commercial break. We will be right back after this brief message.
Stick around.
So, in lieu of an actual commercial break, we decided we were going to take this time to plug organizations doing great things. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, which is a non-profit based in New York City. They raise money for HIV/AIDS research through events and other initiatives in the Broadway community. One of their most popular events is Broadway Bears, a yearly production where performers from the Broadway community get together and create a show full of strip-themed dance numbers on a huge scale. They've been doing Broadway Bear since 1992, with the last 2 years being virtual events due to the pandemic. However, the last live event in 2019 raised over $2 million. Broadway Cares has raised more than $21.8 million since its inception. If you want to get involved, you can donate on their site and sign up for volunteer opportunities, as well as buy merchandise, bid on auctions, buy show tickets, all of which benefit the cause. All of that info and more can be found at BroadwayCares.org. Should we come back from our commercial break with an update on how to properly say this name?
Welcome back to our podcast. I just want to tie up some loose ends. I don't want to be too disrespectful on our very first episode. I want to show the proper amount of respect here. Agnieszka Smolczynska is the Polish filmmaker who will be making the movie based off of the story of the silent twins, June and Jennifer Gibbons.
All right, I'm going to be looking out for that one. When does that come out? Did it say?
It didn't say. It's in like the early process.
Speaking of movies, this week, actually today, quite literally today, a few hours before we did this, I watched for the very first time the original 1979 version of the Amityville Horror, which I had never seen before. I'm not sure why. I'm a big fan of haunted house movies. I'd always meant to watch it, and I have seen the remake with Ryan Reynolds from 2006, 2005, 2006. I think it's 2006. From 2006. But I had never seen this version, and there had been a couple times that I was going to watch it, and it just never felt like the time. But then I started it today and was a little caught off guard by how actually creepy it was. Not that older horror movies from, the 70s, 80s, even the 60s can't be scary. A lot of them really, really are, but then a lot of them really, really aren't. So it's kind of like a toss-up of whether you're going to get something that's actually still feels spooky and doesn't feel dated. And not that this doesn't feel dated at times. There are definitely some effects in it and some moments that are dated, but overall I was very impressed by how consistently spooky it was. Have you ever seen it?
I have not seen this rendition. I think I do briefly remember watching the one that you had referenced with Ryan Reynolds. But I mean, I know the gist. I know this. I mean, I assume that there's like some pre-existing, like where's the horror element? Like, what is like the darkness of the house?
Basically, I'm not sure exactly how much this lines up with the allegedly true story of 112 Ocean Lane in Amityville, but in the movie, they find a mysterious room behind a stone wall in the basement, and one of the characters quite loudly announces that it is the gate to hell. So there's also a, speaking of dated, there is a storyline about not a Native American burial ground, but what they essentially describe as a dumping ground for this particular historical tribe that used to be in the area. It's like where they dumped their sick or people who had lost their minds or things like that. So yeah, a little bit of classic horror Native American appropriation going on there. But yeah, it's essentially just the house is supposed to sit on top of the gate to hell, apparently.
Well, I'll be honest, I forgot that this movie is based on real events, which makes it, I mean, in this movie, this is the 1979 version, so do you by chance happen to know when the actual murders happened?
I sure do. That's actually the first thing that I'm going to talk about today, because I am going to educate these fine people about the crossover or the intersection that seems to happen between haunted house stories and haunted relationships. For lack of a better way to put it, with broken relationships and family trauma, whether that be pre-existing or inspired by the events of a haunting. But with the Amityville house in particular, in 1974, it was occupied by the DeFeo family. And on November 13th, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr., who was the eldest son, shot and killed his 6 family members in the middle of the night. He was sentenced to prison after a lengthy trial during which he claimed he was hearing voices in the house that were urging him to kill his family, and he eventually listened to them. But he was sentenced to 6 sentences of 25 years each in prison, so he was in prison until the end of his life. And he actually died just this past year in March.
Oh, wow. So the murders happened in 1974, and right 5 years later, they're like, we need to make a movie about this tragedy.
It gets worse, because the murders happened in 1974. A year passes, and the Lutz family moves into the house. This is George Lutz and Kathy Lutz. George had married into the family, and they moved in with Kathy's 3 children. They only lasted in the house about 28 days because within no time at all, they were experiencing rotten smells that didn't seem to have a source. Certain rooms were plagued by flies. There were times when the windows would slam shut or just flat out break out of their window frames with no explanation. There's a famous photograph of the screen door, which was blasted off its hinges with no explanation. And throughout that time, George Lutz is beginning to hear voices, according to him. He's beginning to hear voices in the house, talking to him in a similar way that Ronald DeFeo experienced and claimed when he was in court. And all of this comes to a head after just 28 days. In the middle of the night, the family flees the house. They left all of their possessions there. They never went back, and they moved to a different state.
I don't know how people can hear stories like that and think that ghosts aren't real. Hot take.
It's interesting because this is sort of a trope that we see right off the bat in this first episode of American Horror Story, which is a haunted house twisting the male figure, specifically the patriarchal figure. In Amityville's case, into doing harm against his family, and then in Ben's case, I guess you could argue doing indirect harm just by being a shit, but but yeah, it's that same sort of, the male character, the father figure is hearing voices and going into trances and stupors and just seems not himself and is generally confused by what's going on. And in a way that actually kind of aligns a bit with if we want to jump ahead many seasons to Apocalypse, when we revisit the murder house, they make the point that was sort of what happened to Tate. Yes, probably had some issues of his own before they moved into the house, but that it was the evil of the house that was warping Tate and bending him to its will to get him to do the things that he did. So it's a trope that shows up quite often, that of the male figure, but in this particular case, it's, I think, one of the first instances of a haunted house story told on such a big scale that's so much about the breakdown of a family. There's a lot in there about George and Kathy and the state of their relationship and how he feels as like the newcomer in their relationship, and how that gap is widened by their experiences in the house to the point where he sort of feels alienated, and the house is able to latch onto that.
You know, horror in some ways obviously been around for a long time. You know, but it isn't, you know, until recent human history that we've been able to depict horror in more visual forms. And I feel like the 1970s is that not like the pinnacle of kind of jumping on this media train, you know, like giving you horror at like a full scale perspective. And it feels kind of gross to say too, but like to like monopolize on this horrific situation. And it continues to live on.
Exactly. You have other movies from that time period. I'm just off the top of my head, the first thing that came to mind was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is loosely based on a true story, but adapted in such a way that it was very much just, like you said, jumping on the train and kind of monopolizing and exploiting a true tragedy and a true horror story. And in that case, warping it to the point that it doesn't even resemble the original thing, but people still connect it with that, and people still say that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based on a true story, but at the end of the day, the movie itself really isn't.
Well, what better for American horror as a genre than horror that has actually occurred in America?
Exactly. Also, what better for the genre of American horror than just outright exploitation?
True. Capitalism at its finest.
But it's interesting because that trope, while it wasn't necessarily super common before Amityville, I mean, there were haunted house movies before that dealt with the idea of trauma, but Amityville was one of the first that really confronted the idea of a family breaking down under the stress of a haunting. It's one of the first that really deals with what a haunting does to people instead of just how scary it is. In contemporary haunted house stories, that has actually become what I would argue that is the driving theme, is family trauma through the lens of a haunting. One of my personal favorites, Mike Flanagan, who is a fantastic horror director. But the first thing that comes to mind is his Netflix adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, which I would argue is more about the trauma than it is about the haunting. I've always thought about that series, that it's more about the way that experiencing a haunted house and experiencing that impossible, terrible situation drives people apart and breaks down what were previously very strong relationships and very healthy relationships.
I've spent a lot of time like trying to make, because full disclaimer, I believe in ghosts. I feel like I need to get that out right in the get-go. And I'm a very like logical, analytical person most of the time, so I try to justify like how can I believe in this, especially when there are other parts of like a spiritual world that I don't necessarily agree with. And I think it is what I've been able to reconcile with myself is that it is precisely the trauma that creates the haunting. It's the traumatic energy of the horrific situation that leaves a long-lasting impact on the world around.
I lightly believe in ghosts. I don't not believe in ghosts. I don't know that I actively believe in ghosts, but I'm open to the idea because I think it's silly not to be. But no, I would agree with that I think it's kind of the emotional scar that's left on a place or left on an atmosphere by something that's happened or something that was felt. And in this case, in particular, we really get to see kind of the full timeline of that breakdown because just in the flashback sequences, you have the Crane family when they first move into the house. Hugh and Olivia, the mother and the father of that family, have a beautiful relationship. The show really, really, really takes the time to show you how healthy they are together, how healthy they are as parents, how much they respect each other, how much they listen to each other, so that as the events of the haunting begin to increase and their stress levels begin to go up and they become not themselves, the contrast is so much more apparent in the way that it's warping them. In that particular case, it's more the mother figure than the father figure, but that in itself is a trope. And it's a trope that we see in this season of American Horror Story is the mother figure basically driven out of her mind by what's going on and the fact that nobody will believe her, which is also the case with Hill House. But even aside from romantic relationships, you have the sibling relationships in that show. They're all so close. I mean, with the exception of Theo, who is of that teenage time. And they also make a point to talk about how she was always more of like, she did her own thing. She was a bit of a loner, but they were still very close. They were still healthy, but their experiences in the house leave them with lifetime trauma that completely disintegrates the relationships that they once had. You know, another director who focuses a lot on specifically families and the way that these experiences affect their relationships, these familial relationships, is James Wan, who directed the Conjuring series. And even just in that series alone, you have sort of both approaches that we've talked about. In the first one, the family is relatively happy when they first move in. The marriage between the two parents seems to be relatively strong, but then over the course of the film, it's the stress that's put on them. I mean, the mother is possessed by the end of the movie, and the dad is just doing the best he can. The kids are all fucking terrified. But then in the second movie, we're dealing with a very different kind of family. The father figure is absent. The daughters are having some trouble with behavioral issues in school. The mother is drowning in financial issues, and altogether their inter-family communication does not seem to be good. It just generally they seem like they're having a hard time, and in that particular instance, they're brought closer by the end by the things that they experience. Kind of similar with the Insidious movies, which were, I think, what put James Wan on the map as a supernatural horror director, because before that he had just done the Saw movies.
So this idea of, I like the term haunted relationships. There has to be like a pre-existing trauma. I think with the exception of like Hill House, you've already mentioned, all of these relationships are not perfect, and now they're entering like this stressful place where they're going to be challenged. Nathan, I think it's time for our twist ending.
You think it's time for a twist ending?
I do.
I feel like it might be. Okay. All right, so for this particular twist ending, I am bringing y'all some production facts because I'm a big old film nerd and TV nerd and just production nerd in general. And one of the things that I'm very, very passionate about and have been since a young age are film scores. I love them very much, especially horror movie scores. I've always just been fascinated by them and the way that they're written. And the interesting thing about, I guess, American Horror Story in general, but especially this season, is that in addition to having its own original score, they actually use pieces from pre-existing horror movies. So what I did was I looked up which and figured out why. Right off the bat, you have What Lies Beneath, which is a film from 2000 starring Michelle Pfeiffer and Harrison Ford. In particular, this film it's a ghost story. It deals with a dissolving marriage. It handles lies and secrets between these two spouses, infidelity, all of which are huge murder house plot points. It also uses music from Insidious, which, again, haunted house, sort of happy family dealing with horrible situation. But in particular, they use music from Insidious in murder house to accompany really, really intense scares or big jump scares or jarring or bizarre imagery, which is what Insidious is known for. So there's kind of like an association happening there. They also use music from Vertigo, which is a famous Hitchcock film. The score is by Bernard Herrmann, and in this particular case, they use it anytime that Larry is talking about his past, which is interesting because Vertigo deals with obsession and a man haunted by past memories. The 1968 film Twisted Nerve, which Tate's whistled theme that plays during all of the flashbacks, or just like any creepy moment with Tate, there's this whistled theme, and it comes from a movie called Twisted Nerve, which features a disturbed male figure faking mental illness to be closer to the girl that he loves, which is literally Tate's plotline. So I was fascinated by the way that not only were they choosing music from haunted house films and similar media, but the choices were motivated both by what was going on in the story and what those movies were originally about. I thought that was just like very, very smart music supervision on the show's part.
I mean, this is something that you kind of bring up in the moment while we're watching this together, and you had specifically pointed out when they had used like the Insidious soundtrack. And even though I'm sure there are probably very few people who are able to pinpoint when certain sounds or scores are being used in the films that they're watching or the horror that they're consuming, there's still that, like, it's familiar. Again, it's like that the uncanny, where they're like giving you something that you've already heard, maybe you recognize it, maybe you don't, but they're trying to conjure some of those very similar feelings that occurred, when you watch the cult classic. They're just trying to recreate that.
Yeah. So what are you going to tell me about, Monique? What's your twist ending for this week?
As I've already explained, as I've already disclosed, I'm a therapist. I have a very mental health oriented mind, and I'm watching American Horror Story Murder House 10 years later. I think the first time I watched it I was 18 years old, young, naive, and now I'm seasoned and just completely rubbed the wrong way by the way Ben, who is a psychiatrist, behaves.
Do you think they set out to write Ben as the world's worst psychiatrist? Because if that was the goal, congrats.
Well, I've consumed very little media that portrays therapy in any right way. I think that there is this I don't know what the word that I want to use. It's like this heavy-handed contrast, I think, between Ben should know. Ben has this persona where he's all together, and he's delivering you these magical just solutions to your problem, and on a dime psychoanalyzing you and just delivering you the solutions that you need, where he can't turn that perspective on himself. And there's the scene in I don't even know what room that is, the den, I guess, where Vivian peels off all the wallpaper and they find these creepy paintings, and Ben walks in, I think, wanting to get some needs met, and Vivian very naturally is hey, now you did me wrong, we still need time, and he blows his lid, and it's just. So I just want to provide a little psycho education, as I would call it, to what some of these tactics are. I wanted to specifically talk about emotional projection, because in this scene specifically where Vivian is, they're talking about the very emotional experience of her having a miscarriage. And Ben is I don't care that you had to give birth to our dead child that you had to carry around inside of you. You loved the dog more than you loved me. What about me? My needs needed to be met. That's why it was okay for me to go and put my organs inside of another person. So, emotional projection is, we do it all the time. When we see a sad person, especially if it's someone that we care and love about, or it's a situation where we feel comfortable, we smile at them. We're trying to send our emotions to them to let them know that we feel for them, and hopefully letting them know that we're there for them and everything is going to be okay and that we're a safe person for them. There's like, that's more of a positive experience of emotional projection. There's kind of the opposite of when you're the upset person and you see someone smiling and you're upset with them for being cheerful. Like, how dare you experience positive emotion? I'm upset right now. I mean, that's kind of everyday normal experiences. Or like, do you feel anxious right now? Like, are you feeling anxious when really you're the one feeling anxious? Or accusing someone of feeling jealous, or accusing of another person of infidelity when you are the one feeling those things? There's a much more insidious form of emotional projection that turns into emotional manipulation, specifically, and this is a hot button word right now, but specifically in narcissism or with narcissists. And I'm not gonna diagnose anybody in this show. That is futile. You know, these are written characters, but could Ben be a narcissist? Yeah. So that takes a step. It's displayed beautifully in this scene with Ben, where he's like completely devoid of acknowledging Vivian's very emotional expression of what she went through. And he's like, no, but me, feel sorry for me, feel bad for me, think about what I had to go through, to deflect from the poor choices that he ultimately made. I mean, he was unfaithful, and he's trying to justify and in a very gross way blame it on Vivian. Like, you weren't there for me. Ignore the fact that you were going through this awful experience. You weren't there for me, so I had to get my needs met somewhere else. So actually, it's your fault that I cheated. You know?
Can I just say that there is not a single scene in this entire goddamn series that pisses me off the way that one does. I want to throw things at the screen. Especially the moment where he goes, "You got a dog." I'm just like, the difference in the conversations that they're having it's insane.
Well, and you know, we can talk at length about how this relationship was doomed from the beginning, and at this point, like, how much of it is really the house and how much of it is just Ben being a shitty person. The house does not make him any better, but he was making some poor, awful choices before they even moved to Murder House, and he cannot own up to his choices. He cannot take responsibility for his misbehaviors and his indiscrepancies.
This is an interesting case where it's not so much the father figure being totally warped by the house as it is his true nature being brought out, I would argue. I think Ben has been bullshitting for a long time. He's been putting on that father face and the good husband face, even and especially when he does something wrong, he immediately takes the righteous high road. And I think this is a case where the weight of the haunting strips that away from him, and he isn't able to bullshit anymore.
I think that's a good point, that it's the house is revealing his true nature, and maybe, I don't know, maybe that's what the house does all along. You know, I think we can find some emotional challenge in each of these characters, but especially the male figures who've lived in this house. Well, that was an experience. Thank you for listening and for having this experience with us.
Yeah, it's gonna be an invention. It's gonna be a learning experience for us too. But like we said at the beginning, hopefully you guys are learning something interesting along the way.
So this is the point in the episode where Nathan and I are going to discuss episode 1, season 10 of American Horror Story. So for those of you who haven't watched this episode, It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show has concluded for you.
So
come back next week.
I mean, unless you want to be spoiled, but like, where's the fun in that? But yeah, otherwise, if you liked what we had to say this week, you can join us again next week for our next episode. We'll be tackling episode 2 of American Horror Story Murder House on
It's a filthy goddamn horror show.
So, American Horror Story, Season 10, Double Feature, Episode 1, Cape Fear. Thoughts, Monique?
Lots of parallels to what we are rewatching in Season 1.
Eerily so.
Yeah, like this family unit trying to like spice things up a bit, you know, go to a different place, get a new scenery, experience some new things, and much like Murder House, you know, much to like despite my inability to remember things correctly, like you get a lot of information really fast. I mean, you find out key characters in the show who are bloodsuckers like very quickly. And of course, the father just doing the whole family in. Just doing the whole family in.
Again.
And getting so close. I mean, of course they wouldn't leave Provincetown because there would be no season, you know? Like, can you imagine? Like, yeah. And then they left and everyone lived happily ever after. You don't get to know the rest of the story. Of course not. So...
What would have been the tipping point for you? When would you have left?
Being chased with my daughter.
Yeah.
As a pregnant woman.
I think that would have done it.
Down the street.
Did that happen before or after he found the bodies on the beach? Because that was also the moment where I was like, what the fuck? Like, what kind of inspiration are you looking for that this is the ideal place for you to stay?
That was before. That it was the next day where he found the bodies on the beach. And you're right. Like, if being chased by this very unsettling person in a very threatening way wouldn't have been enough for me to be like, okay, we gotta leave this place. Definitely finding disemboweled bodies on a beach would have been like, oh, gotta go.
That would have been it for me.
We're just freezing over the fact that he bludgeoned one of these people in his home. Like that night? Was it that night? Mm-hmm. Like, and to his credit, that's when he decided we gotta go.
Right? That did it for him. Now he's involved. He's like, fuck, it's touched me. I might be the dead one next. I might be the disavowed one. Now I see that there's danger. I just want to say, from like a film nerd and production nerd standpoint, I love this season so far. I love the tone. I love the way that they shot it. I love the music, especially the fact that it's inspired like by the fact that Alma, the daughter, plays the violin. The fact that the score is then creepy string sounds. I love a connection like that. It makes the whole thing feel like cohesive, and it's also a lot of sounds that we haven't heard in the show before, and I really, really love it.
I also think another kind of thread through, you know, season 1 Murder House with what we've seen so far in this season is the daughter is still the most insightful one. The daughter is the one who knows what the fuck is going on.
That girl with her perfectionist issues. Someone's got to talk to her about that. Finn Wittrock's character, just Harry, his name is, he just kind of like taunted her about it. He was like, TikTok, baby. I was like, give this girl a hug.
Yeah, we got to nip that in the bud real fast. I mean, doesn't that speak to like he's doing the best that he knows how to do? I mean, there will be a point where he retrospectively looks at like, oh, I could have definitely rerouted that. But it seems like he's dealing with the same challenge, because at the end of the episode, we see him on a phone call with his agent or whoever, telling him like, we don't give a fuck what's happening to you. You have to write when we say write. So he's dealing with the same like perfectionistic pursuit, and so it's hard to correct another person, you know, when you're dealing with the same challenge. And we do live in a society that just expects and praises this overproduction of being, of work, of doing, of creating, and that's how you show your worth. When, you know what, like, we're all just kind of here. None of us, not a single soul on this earth asked to be here. And we just come here, and like, now you must work and you must pay bills and then you die, and that's it. And that's just what the norm is. So
this season definitely seems to be shaping up to have a lot to say about being an artist and what devoting your life to creativity, into that, not just like overproduction, but overproduction in a way that is deeply personal, and that takes a lot out of people. Like the art takes a lot out of you emotionally and mentally, and I think this season is going to have a lot to say about what that's worth and what the cost is.
Well, even Evan Peters' character, Austin, when he's forcing these black pills on Harry and saying, do you consider yourself to be a writer? Because, frankly, if you don't take these pills, bullshit, you're not a writer. Like, if not releasing the words inside of you makes you want to die, like, that was the framework. If you would rather die than not release the words inside of you, then you're not a writer. It's like,
right? How do you argue with that other than to take the fucking pill?
I just wanted to take a nap. Like, Nathan, I think that we would be remiss if we did not briefly talk about the influences of The Shining. Absolutely.
A lot of Jack Torrance is coming through in Harry Van Witchrock's character. And I believe he said that performance inspired him, which you can definitely see. And I'm interested to see how far they push that and how that develops in later episodes.
It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is created by Monique Quistorf and Nathan Skethway. Nathan also edits and mixes our show.
To find out about the music used in this episode, check out our website at filthygdhorrorshow.com. It's a Filthy Goddamn Horror Show is a podcast created by American Horror Story fans and is in no way affiliated with the show.